Hi, I'm Pat Taub for Truth TV, and I'm very privileged to be able to speak with Kathy Kelly this afternoon. Kathy is an international peace worker who is in Maine on a speaking tour, principally to inform us about some of her work in Afghanistan and some of the conditions there. Kathy has made, I think maybe this is her sixth trip to Kabul, where she's living and working with Afghan peace volunteers. And she has a long history of being in hot spots. She's been in Gaza, she was in Iraq during shock and awe. And she has been a war tax resistor most of her life. She's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize on 3 different occasions. And I think it's time we nominated her again. Maybe we can start a little movement right in Maine. So welcome to Maine, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Well, thank you, Pat. I'm always happy to come to Maine. Actually, what has made me especially eager to come here has been the hospitality that people in Maine have extended toward Iraqi refugees, people who were displaced by that war, and who have really gotten extraordinary welcomes amongst communities in Maine. So I have a great deal of admiration for the peace movement here and for people who understand communities so well.
I'd really like to ask you to elaborate on the Afghan peace volunteers in terms of what their mission is all about and how you're working with them.
Well, the Afghan peace volunteers began in a part of Afghanistan that is almost indescribably beautiful, Bamyan province. And it is, however, a place where many of the people who had fled Taliban attacks resettled, and they came back with very traumatized memories. And so the children of those families have come together with a really remarkable experiment. They want to live together interethnically, even though Abdullah and Zarguna, brother and sister, are Hazara, and their father was killed by the Taliban, and their family had to flee, and little Abdullah almost froze to death in a refugee camp when he was a toddler. Faiz is Tajik, and Hazara fighters killed his brother in front of his eyes. Ali's brother-in-law was killed. They've experienced tremendous suffering and loss, bereavement, and impoverishment, but they see the way forward as being one that overcomes the proclivity towards seeking revenge and seeking retaliation, because they say, shedding blood begets shedding more blood. And so they're trying very, very hard to be serious and practical about developing inter-ethnic activities. And so my most recent travel, I've been so impressed. Seamstresses have come together. Some are clad in the burqa, meaning they're Pashto women. Some are Hazara, they don't wear the burqa. But I don't understand Dari adequately, but I hear their animated, lively voices in conversation over sewing machines that the Afghan peace volunteers have procured. And they work together producing something that might help them with their common problem, which is that they don't have enough bread for their children. And each one of them, now that spanning 4 months since I first met some of them, has said to me, I think I'm going mad. I think I'm losing my mind because I can't feed my children. And some of the children are out on the streets selling candies or Kleenex. It's a very rough job to be a child street vendor. So the Afghan peace volunteers have said to them, go back to school. And they've gotten a donation from an Afghan woman who is very kind, and they can compensate each family for what their kids would have been earning on the streets. And the kids go back to school, and then they all come over in the afternoon for tutoring. So that's been very lively. And then there's a program to teach English to the young women so they can kind of catch up a little bit. And these kinds of inter-ethnic projects give me great hope. It's always too little and too late when you think of the ravages of a country that's had 4 decades of warfare. But here we are now with the United States spending $2 billion per week. Imagine, $2 billion per week,
imagine.
while mothers are saying, I can't feed bread to my children.
Well, and when you speak about the women in Afghanistan, that's a segue to a question I had for you. In an op-ed piece in the New York Times on August 15th, which was just about a week ago, they made a strong statement that the lives of women in Afghanistan have improved in the last decade. They cited the fact that more women are going to school, that there have been laws enacted to stop violence against women, and that the maternity the maternity death rates are down. How do you respond to that piece?
I read the piece and then I started over at the top and reread it again. They do mention the truth that under the governance of President Hamid Karzai of Afghanistan, laws have been put into place that the Taliban had never, under their reign, put forth as actual laws, which are a tremendous rollback on the rights of women, so that women don't have equal rights to men in terms of education or jobs. And a woman domestically within her own home can be denied food and resources by her husband if she's not sufficiently submissive. These are very regressive laws. And this has happened while the United States is supporting Hamid Karzai with the Strategic Partnership Agreement. So without the United States support, President Karzai and the warlords that he's brought into power would not be able to stay in power. The average life expectancy for a woman has gone down to 42.2 years. Afghanistan remains the worst place in the world into which a child can be born and the worst place in the world for women to go through giving birth to a child. There must be advances that the New York Times editorialists are looking toward, but I think in the context of, just for one very visual example that I see, of sprawling military bases. There's one just on the outskirts of Kabul, which if you're driving, you go for 20 minutes and you're still driving along the perimeter of this base. It's right across the road. I mean, just imagine looking across the road from your home to what's on the other side of the street or the road, right across from a squalid and wretched refugee camp, the Charahi Khambar refugee camp. There are 400 new refugees displaced by the war every single day in Afghanistan.
Every day.
And can you imagine we're spending $1 million for one soldier for 1 year? I know the chief logistician at an Italian hospital. I have O-negative blood, so they're always happy to see me in Kabul. And his name is Emanuele Nannini. And the New York Times did a cover story on him in the hospital about 2 months ago. Emanuele said to me, Allora, can you imagine? Just you send 6 of your soldiers home and you give us this $6 million, what we can do. So the squandering of so much of United States resources and wealth on a war which now, in the polls in the United States, gets 70% disapproval. 70% of the U.S. public say they know that this war is futile. Why do we continue the jobs? The jobs in the United States are tied up with the military spending and with what Dwight Eisenhower warned us about, the military-industrial complex. And I think that's why the wars continue, because war profiteers want it that way. And of course, the United States wants to be able to say to China and to Russia, we have a strong military presence in this landlocked territory that borders on your countries.
Yeah, that theory's been advanced a lot, and I think it's certainly growing in terms of some kind of acceptance. But, I want to go back to the plight of the women, because I was thinking you have a pretty high profile as a peace worker. And I wondered if you've ever tried to make contact with Hillary Clinton, who always says that she advocates the rights of women. You would be in a wonderful position to influence her and to try to encourage her to put into place some of the policies you've talked about, just the basic program of training women to sew and to create some income for their families. Have you had any contact with Hillary?
Well, one of the young women that I know well in Kabul, her name is Farzana, and she heard that Hillary Clinton's formula for what her State Department wants to see happen in Afghanistan is fight, talk, build. And Farzana looked at me and she said, Kathy, why can't it be make friends, talk, build. As long as the United States State Department wants to say that our foreign policy is based on threat and force, it doesn't matter if you have a woman or a man sitting in that Oval Office or directing the State Department. The choice has been made on behalf of threat and force, using the means that include killing and torture and imprisonment and displacement and bereavement, because that's what threatens people, and that's what forces people to be subservient to United States policies. So, it troubles me greatly when Hillary Clinton, along with Madeleine Albright, along with formerly Condoleezza Rice, there's quite a long string of women you can name, say that Amnesty International, for instance, ought to institute a program saying keep the U.S. forces in Afghanistan for the sake of the Afghan women. I talk to Afghan women and they're mirthful when I tell them the very notion that the United States troops should be staying there to protect them. But what is it that will keep the United States public from rising up, 70% of the public, and saying, we will no longer support this war. We don't want these kinds of jobs. If you can convince the U.S. public that there's a humanitarian reason for the war, we went into Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We're in Afghanistan because we have to protect the women. What you'll win is a level of indifference because people feel uncertain. And they'll be more cautious about opposing the war, even though rationally they know there's something fundamentally flawed in our wars.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that's a really fascinating thesis. The humanitarian aspect is a way to sell war. And I suspect there's a lot of truth to that. To go back to the New York Times again, they published, which you may have seen, or maybe you were in Afghanistan about 2 weeks ago, there was an editorial that created a lot of controversy because they said drones are a humanitarian effort. They don't kill that many innocents. And there's so many people on the ground who have a very different impression or a different story. Could you talk a little bit about how drones have impact on Afghanistan and what it's doing to the average person who lives there, that is the drone campaign?
Well, people in Afghanistan talk about planes without pilots, and Fazila has asked me how she should tell her son that his father was killed by a computer. Fazila is a young widow. Her husband was a student. He was in a garden with 4 other students, and a Hellfire missile was fired by a drone and dismembered all of the students. This was in the Maidan Wardak province, and the thing that I think is extremely troubling is the proliferation of the drones is going to be happening worldwide. I mean, after World War II, one country had the nuclear weapon. And look at us now. And it isn't just one drone flying through the sky. To keep that drone effective, you have to have satellite control. And the 49 countries involved in NATO are not all sufficient in and of themselves to have that kind of satellite control of drone weaponry. But this is like the Lady Gaga of the weapon industry. And so they all want to acquire drones. Well, that means they have to more or less rent the United States satellite systems. And so the United States is gaining more and more control over outer space and over surveillance. There's 65 to 70,000 United States Air Force employees analyzing the footage that's collected by these drones. Well, that in itself seems to me to be unspeakably wrongful when you've got women saying they think they're going mad because they can't feed their children. And what is the job description of the people analyzing all this footage? They're supposed to establish patterns of life in Afghanistan. Well, talk to young Fazila and find out about the pattern of her life as a young widow who can't feed her child. And then talk to the mother-in-law, the mother of her husband that was killed. And she feels a white-hot rage. She says they do not ask, who is this, who was that? We find out that they killed our sons because there were doubts, because there were suspicions. Well, you've got all these drones flying over Pakistan and over in Afghanistan. Can't they know that 8 shepherds were on a mountainside grazing their flocks and they were gunned down in cold blood? Can't they see that 6 kids were trying to collect scrap metal on a mountainside and they were gunned down in cold blood? What is the efficiency and the efficacy of these so-called superior weapons? And what kind of a world are we moving into when outer space is going to be used by the United States and other major superpowers? Do we think that the Chinese government and military are going to say, oh, sure, let the United States get ahead of us in this? This is a Cold War, and this is a technology that's doing just what weapons have always done, robbing the poor from the capacity to feed their children.
You know, when you cite those very compelling examples of innocent people who were killed by drones, people sitting in their garden, or the shepherds, those kind of stories, I think, would wake up the American public. Is there anybody who's documenting those stories in the form of perhaps a film or a photographic essay that would make it possible to get those, the personal stories, you know, carry a lot of weight, that would make it possible to get those stories into this country, or is there some censorship that makes it difficult?
Well, that's a very good question, Pat. I'm critical of the most recent editorial from the New York Times, but you know, the New York Times Magazine section carried a very insightful story about the Italian hospital that I just mentioned, and about how the military at times has turned people away who've been brought to their hospitals as victims of U.S. warfare. There are stories that the New York Times has covered about the numbers of children that froze to death in the refugee camp that I just mentioned. They know that they've covered the story. 28 children froze to death in just Kabul, and 100 throughout the country, and 8 children within the refugee camp froze to death over the past very, very harsh winter. And they would know, some of their reporters, exactly where to go to talk to a goat herder whose family was attacked by a drone, and 5 children were killed. The man's wife was killed, and his niece is now armless, and his nephew is curled up in the fetal position. His leg was mangled, and they don't have any medicines. If I talk to that family, they tell me the journalists have come with some regularity, and they're even feeling bitter. You know, our story is told and no one helps us still, and I look around and I feel abject because I can see they don't have fuel for the winter and they don't have blankets adequate to cover them. I mean, these stories are available. So the question, what will move the United States public? And I think that, again, the think tanks are told, go to work and figure out how we get rid of the Vietnam syndrome. Because after the Vietnam War, I think people in our generation knew the U.S. public, particularly younger generations, were sick of war. We didn't ever want to have the statistic of 50,000 body bags coming back of the young people who could have been our next door neighbors or our, sit next to you in the classroom. We were cringing at the thought that 2 to 3 million Vietnamese people had been killed in this fruitless, stupid, horrific war. And people didn't want more war. So how do you overcome the Vietnam syndrome? Get rid of the draft. Don't conscript anyone. Maybe have a backdoor poverty draft. Make sure there aren't pictures of coffins coming back. And then give people the impression that it's a humanitarian war. Make them feel good about having gotten rid of Saddam Hussein. Make people feel good about protecting Afghan women. Put young Aisha's picture on Time magazine, whose face was mutilated by these wicked and wild Pashtun Taliban fighter-type figures. Well, I know a young engineering student in Bamyan, and he asked me, Kathy, do American people care more about noses than fingers? And I looked at him and I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. And he held up that picture, a black and white photocopy of the picture of the Time magazine cover. And there was young Aisha with her mutilated nose and otherwise beautiful face. And I was still trying to figure out what is he talking about, and he left it. I came back to the United States, opened up the New York Times, and I read about the Stryker Brigade that had systematically gone about executing innocent civilians and then cutting off their body parts and storing them in jars to bring them home as war trophies. Now, that's a ghastly story, but that's exactly the story my young friend was talking about. Do Americans care more about noses than fingers? Because he knew that innocent people had been executed and their body parts cut off. Now, I, the peace activist, didn't even know the story. But there are plenty more of these kinds of stories. You know, a young American soldier goes out with his gun and walks into family households and just starts shooting and following the Quran burning, the violence that occurred with that, the urination on other people's bodies. How many such stories? How many apologies for combat brigade unit helicopters that have flown over mountainsides and shot down shepherds in cold blood? How many of these stories are the Afghan people supposed to take and absorb and say, well, this is right because we happen to live in Afghanistan? And these are the people who have superior weapons.
However, yes, I mean, I certainly understand what you're saying. I think there are Americans who care, who feel helpless. I mean, I'm getting very outraged and very moved by the stories you're telling. And I think people would like to be able to do something if they knew what to do. I'm kind of wondering if there could be any kind of personal exchange, like could women in this country identify a women's community in Kabul or somewhere else where they could exchange letters or exchange, well, maybe not pictures of their families because they would see how much better off we are. But I think there are people who would like to have some connection. You know, Medea Benjamin is taking a group to Pakistan to talk with people who have been the victims of drones, to again collect the story. So I'm asking you, what a viewer can do who's listening and says, I don't want to continue to take this. I don't want to be lumped into this group of Americans who don't care.
Well, I'm so fortunate to be in love with 7 teenagers, these Afghan peace volunteers. They're young kids. And every month, on the 21st of every month, they do a phone call. And it's there's no video capacity. We use Skype and we call their cell phones. And they're scattered in different parts of the country sometimes, but a number of them are also in Kabul. And their sisters are part of it, but they can't be photographed at all. But sometimes you can hear from them as well. And the phone call includes young people from Gaza, sometimes from Egypt. This just the 21st of August, there were young people from Ecuador, from Long Island, from various parts of the world where people are also undergoing either a war against the poor at home or warfare in their own land. And it's very impressive to me that they've tried to enable that outreach, and they really welcome U.S. people to be part of that. So anyone could just go to a website, ourjourneytosmile.com, and be in touch with videos that these young people produce. They've got 129 videos, and also know how to get on board with this monthly phone call. Also in December, they are having an International Human Rights Day event, which they want people all around the world to join. December 10th is International Human Rights Day. Mairead Maguire, the Nobel Peace Laureate, retired Colonel Ann Wright, a great leader of many efforts worldwide for peace, Reverend John Deere, a number of peacemakers will gather with them in Kabul to commemorate 2 million people in Afghanistan that have been killed over 4 decades of warfare, but to immediately say we want to commemorate their lives not by seeking revenge and retaliation, but instead by looking for 2 million friends. And they want 2 million people to join them in asking the United Nations to negotiate a ceasefire amongst all the warring parties, all 49 countries that are there as part of the NATO warfare, trying to get the Pashtun fighters, the Hazara fighters, the Tajik fighters, the warlords, the proxy fighters coming over from Pakistan and Iran, everybody lay down the weapons. Now that's a very idealistic hope, but it's a start. And I've seen them start these kinds of projects in my own experiences living with them. So I actually have great hope, and I hope that the U.S. public would pay attention to that. If we listen to the young people, Afghanistan is a country where, according to Australia's aid program director, 65% of the country are under 18 years of age. Now, that's a very young country.
Yes.
And I think if we listen to what young people are saying, that can often be a guide, kind of an arrow for where we might go.
Well, thank you. That does give viewers an opportunity to get involved. And I really want to thank you for speaking with us and for putting a human face on the horrible conditions in Afghanistan. Would you like to add anything before we end this little interview?
Well, I know that people care deeply about their children and about their grandchildren. And, in a time when jobs are declining, people are anxious that they don't want to rock the boat in many ways. But I think the essential care for children and grandchildren worldwide and in our own communities means looking toward a future where the bloated and really unwise expenditures that beef up the war profiteering system would be changed so that we create jobs that actually enable people to make things that are good for people and to do things that are good for people. If we continue to say that the military gets to control all of the jobs in the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex controls another set of jobs, then we'll never be able to create worthwhile, life-giving, and needed job opportunities. So I think we have to take away the myth that the military keeps us secure and the military keeps us employed, and challenge that. And every time we have access to an audience, every time we have a possibility to do that informal education, raise the issue that people care about. They want jobs. They want to take care of their children, and dismantle the notion that the military gives us security.
I think that's brilliant, and it's right on the mark. Could you mention again the website that you mentioned about, what was it, putting a smile on the face, and also the website for the Afghan Volunteers for Peace organization?
Well, Voices for Creative Nonviolence is vcnv.org, and we rent an apartment in Kabul and stay in touch with the young people that are part of the Afghan Peace Volunteers. They named their website Our Journey to Smile because a young rag picker was fleeing a refugee camp to go to Iran and see if he might get a better job. And their coordinator, who's a medical doctor from Singapore, was very close to this young boy, Najib. And he said, "Najib, let me take your picture before you go." And then, as people say all over the world, he said, "Smile." And the grandmother went ballistic. She said, "How can you say smile to this young boy? He is an orphan. He is now leaving to go to another country. He has never had anything to smile about, and he never will." And very chastened, this, at the time, young MD formed a website called Our Journey to Smile, convinced that we all have a joint responsibility to make sure that every child has a reason to smile. So that's why you have that ourjourneytosmile.com website. And I guess I would also urge people to be in touch with their own local groupings. So much is being done in Maine that's valuable and worthwhile. And of course, to pay attention to the news with Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!, for instance. But keep space for peace and stay in touch with Code Pink, and be very, very glad that so much dynamic energy does get created. I think our world could be in a much more alarmingly difficult situation were it not for people committed to peace and the people committed to justice.
I want to thank you very much for speaking with us today, and I wish you all the best as you go back to Afghanistan. And I think Mainers will be with you in their hearts as you do this work.